Chapter 22, Lylan 12.17, March 28, 2311 AD. Murmurs and whispers began to shower down from the crowd as they watched Lylan, who they'd known only as Emma Carter, lift her arms from the slots in the chair and free her head from the forehead strap. They buzzed louder as Lylan held Daniel's hands in place against her temples, keeping him attuned to the blessing, and leaned forward, then loosened and freed her legs. She could hear Rosa calling her sister's name, but she stayed focused on the demon. Gasps and stifled cries echoed down as she then reached around to the back of the emissary's head and grabbed a fistful of his hair. Then she pinched his forehead with her other hand and pulled hard until a sizable slice of skin was torn from his forehead, and with it came the demon. She pulled slowly, fingertips sunken into the shadow's forehead, separating the spirit from the host body, careful to keep his black hands on the sides of her head as she peeled them from their place within the arms of the poor emissary. Tony, the proud representative of Daniel for the occasion, was dying. Without Daniel to maintain brain activity, his autonomic life functions ceased. His heart stopped beating, his fingers stopped feeling. Daniel had learned long ago the catastrophic consequences of uncontrolled departure from a vessel body. In order to properly care for the emissary, Daniel had to form inside of them, maintain homeostasis for them, and then carefully dissolve inside of them, allowing for a non-traumatic transitioning of consciousness between the emissary and himself. Tearing them apart as Lylan was doing was a death sentence for the emissary. The cameras were still rolling, and the world was watching as Lylan braced the poor man's body to the chair, pinning it down with her foot. Then she grabbed the dark shadow by the throat and continued to gradually cut him away from his host body until he was completely free of the now dead emissary who slumped over sideways in the chair. At their point of contact, where his fingertips touched her temples, the connection could clearly be seen. His fingertips were not merely touching the surface, they were sunken inside of her head. Little black strings like pulled taffy could be differentiated extending from his knuckles as they coiled and writhed, moving in and out of Lylan's head like a twisted system of pulleys, creating little black puddles against her skin where he touched her. He was still entranced. He could see through the eyes of everyone, but he keyed off of certain chemical reactions or heightened states of emotion. He was not focused on what was happening in the museum. By the time he would turn his attention to Lylan, it would be too late. "Emma!" Rosa desperately screamed for her sister and reached out for her as museum staff held her back. No one knew what to do. There was no such thing as a security guard. There was only Daniel. Who saves Daniel? Lylan turned to face her, and Rosa immediately stopped crying and quickly withdrew from reaching for her, because she recognized instantly that the person she was looking at was not her sister. Then it was confirmed. "My name is Lylan," she said. Then she turned back to face the demon. The noise of the crowd erupted as her name was said over and over and over again. Then Daniel took notice. He materialized in the room and was about to intervene when Lylan let go of his throat and grabbed him by the wrists, then forcibly severed the bond of the blessing mid-ritual, pulling his hands away from her head, and yelled, "Wake up, demon!" Then he collapsed. As the version of himself that had formed on the blessing stage reached for her, the instant before he would have grabbed her shoulder from behind, he fell limp and passed right through her and was pulled headlong into the version of himself that which she had a hold of, and she lurched forward a smidgen as it tore through her clothing on its way through her body. Everywhere that the spirit was had suddenly become a dangerous place to be, as he was violently wrenched from every place at once. The devastation was ungodly, as he had become like several 100 million bullets the size of a full-grown man, all hurtling toward the museum, coming in from nearly every direction. He burst through the walls of every inhabited building on Earth, ripped streets apart, and knocked light poles and telephone poles down. Anything that did not move out of his path was moved through. They were all falling in on the museum, on the spirit form that Lylan held firmly in her clutches, and he was helpless to stop it. He was becoming a single entity, and his many selves were flying toward them at speeds upwards of 100 miles per hour. In an instant, every Dwyer pod in the sky was robbed of its pilot and suddenly plummeted to the ground as his spirit forms were torn from them, bursting through the flimsy pods like they were made of eggshells. Several tens of millions of his children died from their pods having fallen alone. Everywhere he had once been, he was then gone from, having been ripped away by Leyland, and all of his many embodiments were now uncontrollably descending on the museum, tearing through whatever structure might stand in the way, including the bodies of his own brood. In and around the Daniel Dwyer Museum, splintering crashes and screams were becoming white noise as the many forms of the spirit tore the museum grounds apart. Leyland, taking advantage of the demon's temporary state of shock, pulled him close and again took a hold of his throat, again sinking her fingers into his being. It felt like he was composed of tightly woven fibers, like layer upon layer of cobwebs or fiberglass, and nothing at all like human skin. He tried to grab for her, but his hands passed right through her like she was thin air. Then she took 2 steps to her left, effortlessly dragging the weightless shadow with her, to stand in the exact place preordained by her visions past that would ensure her survival. The crowd was stunned. At first, when it was just a few dozen Daniels at a time barreling through the people in the courtyard like a rhinoceros, knocking people around like a wrecking ball had come swinging through, and leaving a wake of injured and dead before slamming through the walls of the museum, it didn't seem so deadly. But when they started pouring in by the hundreds and then the thousands, it became apparent that escape was not possible. The people in the viewing arena had no way down as the ground level was being bombarded, and they cried in unison as the structure began to destabilize and fall apart around them. The crowd outside was trying to rush outward and disperse, but was being forced back into a tight circle by the incoming flow of spirits, effectively crushing one another, and as the onslaught of weaponized souls grew ever more dense, and the museum began to topple over and crumble, every person there ended up being diced to pieces, as did the museum, the surrounding land, and most of the nearby buildings for miles. When the ceiling fell, it fell in such a way that Leyland was directly underneath where the open skylight had been, and as everything else was crushed around her, she stood there without a scratch on her, only fine dust and powder having fallen on her as the open space in the ceiling fell right on top of her, keeping the blind woman from being crushed. Daniel was desperately flailing at her hand, trying to free himself, but he could not touch her. He could not pry her fingers from his neck. By interrupting the blessing whilst maintaining the neural connection, she had somehow taken advantage of their conjoined nervous system, and, at least temporarily, she had assumed the role normally attributed to him in these kinds of interactions. He could not touch her, but she could touch him. She stood completely naked. The wave of spirits passing through her had shredded the last bit of her clothing from her body. The destruction was by far the worst in Dwyer, Nevada, at the epicenter of his collapse, but the devastation caused by his rapid departure from the rest of the world was also elsewhere everywhere quite severe. Every active emissary had died instantly, as did any other person whose body he'd been in possession of at the time, mothers in labor, anyone undergoing surgery, and so on. Daniel's spirit having been wrenched from their bodies and minds in unison. Many people had been smashed against walls or other hard bodies, crushed between Daniel and any number of objects just for having been in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the path of one of the speeding ghosts. Everywhere there were people, there was dying and suffering. It was the end of civilization. It was the end of the world. The many incarnations of his soul were still spilling in around and through her, falling in on the one version of him as she addressed him. Blind eyes turned to nowhere, every syllable laced with hate. She said, "You have lost and I have won, demon. You are mine. My name is Leyland. I have come to remove you as ruler of this world, but first I have to tear down this monstrosity you have erected so that the world may be rebuilt bereft of your image. I have been watching you, waiting for this moment for thousands of years. Are you watching them, Daniel? Seeing through their eyes as I do?" Daniel stopped struggling to escape, accepting the futility, and pointed his head in her direction as if to look at her, his features indistinguishable from the rest of his deep darkness. The audaciousness of this creature was unbelievable. He had never before been threatened in such a way, but she was obviously well ahead of him on this path. This was evidently the culmination of a plan aimed at him, a bid for control, for his power, and he was beginning to put together all the ways in which she had readied herself for the moment. He couldn't see through her eyes. She was blind. So he could not pinpoint her orientation, divine her exact location without the use of another's eyes unless she made noise or otherwise drew attention to herself, and even then he would be swinging at her in the dark. He could not touch her so long as she maintained physical contact with him, nor could he divide his form, not unless she were to release him, as he was in some sort of unprecedented quasi-blessing type conjoined state with this creature that had taken his Emma away. He was her prisoner, and he started putting pieces of the puzzle in place. Obviously, this Lylin was well prepared for this moment, so much so that she had ensured that he could not so easily find her by rendering her eyes useless to both her and him, which was very, very clever. But he thought her arrogant, foolish, and vain for speaking to him. Now he knew the sound of her voice. It was the familiar voice of his favorite daughter, but also that of someone else, that of this Lylin as she called herself. She had given him something to zero in on, a place to aim should he break free of her grasp. "Do you feel them dying as I do?" she prodded, knowing well that he could not speak while in his spirit form. "Oh, if you think this is bad, just wait until you see what happens when they start to believe that you aren't coming back to save them. They are going to tear each other apart, and there won't be a thing you can do about it. Keep watching. There hasn't been a theft, a murder, or a rape on Earth in over 2.5 centuries, but that's all about to change. Your precious children have been given the freedom to do as they will, and they're going to do what people with the freedom to act of their own accord have always done, as they've been doing ever since you came along and broke this world. They're going to kill one another. You can expect the first murder in a little less than 3 hours. Those peaceful souls that remain, once your savages have decimated one another, will serve as the foundation for the population of a new world, a free world. I know you're thinking that you're going to regain control of things here, but let me assure you, this is no longer your world. It never was. It has always been and will forever be mine. I see deep into the future, demon, and I know everything that you're going to do, everywhere you will be, and more importantly, everywhere that will be free of you. In about 2 hours, Christopher and Amy Proctor will be coming here to try and find you, 2 of your precious children. They will be the first of many to come here in search of you. She pointed to a place on the ground about 20 feet away and said, "They are going to die right there, right in front of you. I know you are as blind as I am, but I'm pointing to the exact place where you get to watch them die. It happens about 20 feet in front of us, and I won't have to lift a finger. This will serve as but a small demonstration of my power, demon, and a warning to you. If you don't want to lose them all, you will do as I say. And if you do not do as I say, every last person on the planet will perish. You will see." More than 60% of the world's total population was already dead, having died within the first minutes of Lylin's takeover, simply due to her violent arrest of the spirit. By the day's end, many, many more would die, most from the collapse of structures weakened because of the global onslaught by Daniel's many spirits. And this was only the beginning. The rest were not far behind. Armageddon had begun. Daniel Dwyer 19, October 30th, 2054 AD. The doctor stayed away. He'd returned to Las Vegas like planned, but instead of going home, he rented a motel room and did nothing more than watch the news. He knew that it was just a matter of time before his house would be raided by the police. He knew that he himself was most likely bound for prison, and that Daniel would either be dead by the day's end or be institutionalized or hospitalized for the rest of his life, as he would never be deemed fit to stand trial. The disappearance of Hannah Dunn was going to be solved. They were going to be exposed, and their whole world was going to fall apart. So, he made the best of his remaining time and stayed drunk. If he was going to prison, he would be damned if he was going to go sober. The operation took place at 8 a.m. A veritable fleet of unmarked vehicles converged on the doctor's house, and an army of armed men and women descended upon it. Daniel could be seen clear as day through the window by the front door. He was just standing there, staring into the empty palm of his outstretched right hand. The officer that discovered him began to yell orders at him through the window, but Daniel didn't react in the slightest. The officer had a gun pointed at him and had the authority to shoot to kill, but then he noticed that the man was standing in a puddle of what seemed to be his own urine, and there was feces next to the innermost part of his bare left foot, and that there was nothing in his hand where they'd been told to expect a toy magic 8-ball, if not a similarly sized spherical object, and he realized that Daniel was harmless. So he did not shoot. He chose not to kill him. He radioed the company and said, "Hostile is unarmed and seems unresponsive. Apprehend, do not shoot." Then he watched as more officers broke through the windows and doors around the first level of the house and roared inside like a wave. They surrounded Daniel as he calmly stood there, unmoving, 20 people yelling at him all at once, some telling him to put his hands up, some telling him not to move, others telling him to get on the ground. If he'd have been anyone else, he'd probably have died right then and there, panicking in the fray and provoking a bullet in an attempt to comply with their contradictory demands. But his face was calm, his breathing was calm, he stank like hell, and he looked tired. Otherwise, he did nothing. He just stood there like a statue. They finally decided to bum rush him, and in accordance with their plan, some forced his hands behind his back and cuffed him, while others patted him down. Then they laid him down on his belly, soaking the front of his shirt in the puddle of his urine. Then their 3 biggest picked him up and carried him out of the door, one at his legs and one at each of his elbows. It was painful, not an enjoyable way to be carried, and he felt every moment of it, but he did not react. He could not react. That part of him was missing. The doctor was passed out, and he didn't hear the police banging on the door when they arrived at the motel. He didn't wake up even as they opened the door and broke the bolt that he had put in place. When they came in shouting, guns directed at him, all the authorities got in response from him was a loud snore. Dr. Foster was lying flat on his back, hands folded across his belly, shoes on his feet, feet on the floor, fully clothed, on top of the blankets of the motel bed, snoring loudly. It was an insufferably loud sound, like that of a chainsaw being tossed into a wood chipper. 2 empty whiskey bottles were on the ground within arm's reach of him. The officers secured the bottles as they were potential weapons, and then they sat him up, put handcuffs on him, stood him up, and walked him down to a squad car. He stumbled a little bit, but he stayed on his feet, and he didn't say a word. As soon as he was in the back of the car, he went right back to sleep. His snoring wasn't as bad when he was sat up, but every now and then a good loud one got through, and the rearview mirror would actually vibrate, much to the amusement of the officers. With the exception of the recent assassination of President Thomas, both of the transporting officers were publicly on the fence with regard to the activity of the spirit, and secretly enthusiasts, somewhat supportive of his vigilantism, and they sympathized with the doctor, themselves knowing what a dilemma it would be to have to decide whether or not to allow the spirit's crusade to continue as the doctor had, or to stop it and let good people die if burdened with the choice. It was a question really of which was the lesser of the 2 evils. As far as they were both concerned, it was unethical either way. Unethical to stop him from saving innocent people who would otherwise die, allowing them to die instead. And it was also unethical to allow him to continue killing rapists and murderers unchecked. There was a process. One needs a rubber stamp, the approval of a disconnected superior human being, to tell them that it has become acceptable to kill another human being. Without the stamp, it's just not right. Then, it's just murder. Daniel could not be imprisoned. There were certain minimum criteria for admittance of any individual to any jail or prison. No person was incarcerated who was medically unsound, and Daniel was practically comatose. If his eyes weren't open, one might have assumed that he was sleeping. He did not respond to commands or stimuli of any kind, and could not in the slightest take care of even his own most basic needs, such as eating and using the restroom. He was initially brought to a facility, one of the local state prisons, for holding, but he was almost immediately rejected by the resident medical staff, and was only there long enough to get fingerprinted and have his mugshot taken before being taken to an emergency room for evaluation, and there he stayed. The place was called Cadence Klein Memorial Hospital. He was once more catheterized and had yet another feeding tube inserted into his side, and again found an IV drip hydrating him. His body was strapped down to the hospital bed, both his wrists and ankles secured by strong straps, and a set of handcuffs bound his right wrist to the bed rail for good measure. His chest and legs were also strapped down tight, and they'd put large absorbent pads underneath him for when he would have to defecate. And so, Daniel Dwyer, the alleged spirit, and the man who was now at the center of a furious debate and was truly the focus of the world at the moment, looked about as pathetic as any man ever had. The television facing his bed was set to the news, and an interview was airing with a former employee of the mental hospital where he'd been housed in his youth, who told the world that the people at the hospital, patients and staff alike, had called him Mr. 8 because of his incessant use of the 8-ball, the whereabouts of which were currently unknown. The name stuck, and within a week everyone was calling him by his new old pseudonym, and for the rest of his short life, that's what he was called by most of the public. In the future, he would be known simply as Daniel. None of his children would ever call him by anything other than his name unless they were being facetious. His many titles would end with the deaths of those that came before. The old world had feared him and fought over him, but his children would love him and celebrate him, and would have no need to name their fear in the way those of the old world had, as no fear of him would exist in their world, not until just before the end. Lyelin 12.18, March 28, 2311 AD. Lyelin just stood there amid the devastation that was once the Daniel Dwyer Museum, with Daniel by the throat, awaiting the proctor's arrival. Her arm was getting tired, but her resolve was not. Nothing would stand in her way. The sun was setting when the two arrived. Christopher and Amy Proctor had been raised as house siblings, and had started experimenting sexually with each other when they were 12 years old. They were now in their 30s and were a strong couple. Marriage did not exist anymore, but if it had, they would surely have been married, childhood sweethearts as they were. They walked up toward the side of the museum, where Lyelin stood on a mound amid the pit that Daniel had burrowed during his collapse, like she was at the top of a small pyramid. The grounds had been completely pulverized, and nothing that was once there was distinguishable from soft ash and soil. The bodies of the thousands of people, the exhibits in the museum, the structure itself, everything was just a fine layer of brown soil, like the whole of the area had been diced and put through a sifter, except for the ground directly under Lyelin's feet, which put her on an almost perfectly symmetrical hilltop. She watched as the couple approached, and saw Amy begin recording and broadcasting the interaction. Luckily, there were just enough repeater stations still intact to broadcast a signal. Most of the nearby towers had been destroyed during the collapse, but Amy's device had enough range to receive and send a weak signal. The ground was soft underneath their feet, and as they drew closer, they began to have to wade through the soil like it was a shallow body of water. "Okay," Amy said, the two of them now about 100 feet away. "I don't know if you can see this. There we go." The focus on her camera did its thing, and the dimly lit image of what looked to be Emma Carter holding Daniel by the throat atop the mound became clear. "This is Amy and Christopher Proctor. We are in Dwyer, Nevada, at the site of what used to be the Daniel Dwyer Museum. And it looks like Emma Carter, or Lyelin as she said she was called, still has Daniel under her control, but it appears that he is still alive," Amy said, talking to the camera. Lyelin's gaze was aimed right at them. As Emma so often had, she was using their eyes to see herself, and she couldn't help but crack a little smile when she saw the scene, very satisfied with herself. Everything was happening exactly the way that it was supposed to. There she stood, naked and blind, with their God under her thumb, atop a hill carved by her power. It was symbolic of the transition of faith from one God to another, of the transformation that which was being wrought in the minds of those watching as they witnessed the vulnerability of the once thought all-powerful being exploited by one evidently even more powerful. She whispered to Daniel, "Here they come." Amy grabbed Christopher's hand as they steadily walked closer, and she continued her narrative, the viewership skyrocketing according to the tracker. "We are going to try and find out what's going on. Again, what you are seeing is Daniel Dwyer in the hands of Lyelin, who was formerly known as Emma Carter. From the path of destruction here, I believe we are at ground zero for the event that just rocked the world, the sudden removal of Daniel Dwyer from the rest of the planet. He is here. We're going to get closer and talk to this Lyelin." Lylin smiled at them, which could not be seen as well in person because of the distance between them, but was very apparent in the video feed, and then she motioned with her free hand for them to come closer. Daniel was holding a hand out at them, palm facing out, indicating for them to stop and stay away, but they only hesitated briefly before continuing forward at Lylin's beckoning. With still about a good 50 feet between them, Christopher called to her in a raised voice. "Let him go!" "Absolutely not," she said calmly. "Who are you?" he asked, the pair still slowly approaching, inching closer and closer to the place where Lylin had indicated that they were going to die. "My name is Lylin, and I have come to liberate mankind, to free you of the rule of this monster, the demon Daniel Dwyer," she said, again calmly as could be. "Your choices are now yours to make, and your world is now ready to be reclaimed. He can no longer control what you do. You are now free to have your own children, to live and love and die as was always intended, not under the rule of any one master, but free to govern yourselves. I see into the future like your Emma Carter once did, only my vision is not limited to a mere 8 days as hers was. I see everything, and for all time, and I am guiding you to a better world, a world free of tyranny." Amy tightened her grasp on Christopher's hand. The notion of having her own children hitting her hard, perhaps because of her age, suddenly throwing her perception of the unfolding events into uncertainty. Suddenly, she questioned whether or not the comfort of yesterday was better than a new but frightening tomorrow. They continued to close the gap, and Daniel continued to gesture for them to stop, but for some reason they didn't. Destiny kept them on track to meet their deaths. They had never known fear, and were unaccustomed to having to be cautious, and they intended to free Daniel. There was no way to do that from a distance, but if they could get close enough, Christopher could use the makeshift weapon he'd hidden, a piece of steel pipe that had been blown out into the streets when Daniel had erupted through the town, to assail her and loosen her grip on their benefactor. Christopher's resolve remained strong, as he was loyal to Daniel down to his roots, but Amy was having second thoughts. "People everywhere are dead, hurt, and dying because of what you did," Amy said. "Why should we believe anything you say?" "Because, Amy Proctor," she said, "I am not lying to you. Ask yourself who this world belongs to, the people of Earth or this demon, and consider who it should belong to, who its rightful owner is. He took your world by force, and now he will be forced to let go of it. You are slaves to him no more. You are free, and yet here you are, ready to rush back into the arms of subjugation, into a life not your own. You intend to kill me and free your master. Let me tell you right now, so that I can dispel any notion you may have of possible success, there is no version of the future in which you ever touch me, but there are many in which you die trying. Challenge me at your own peril. Amy and Christopher Proctor, you have been warned." Christopher, feeling defensive, many times the size of this petite blind woman who threatened him, took this as an affront to his masculinity, just as Lylin had foreseen ages ago he would, and let the piece of pipe descend from his sleeve into the grip of his trembling hand. They were about 10 feet from the mark, the place where Lylin had predicted their death, 30 or so feet from where Lylin calmly held Daniel in her outstretched hand, and slowly closing in as Daniel frantically tried to motion for them to back away. "It looks like your hands are a little full at the moment. Exactly how are you going to kill us without letting go of Daniel?" Christopher asked. "I kill you without the use of my body. I don't have to touch you to kill you. Keep coming and find out how if you're so curious." Her smile faded away. Amy looked around. There didn't seem to be anything but the soft dirt anywhere nearby, but she was suddenly very nervous, and a paranoid fear of her impending death washed over her like she'd just fallen down a well. But Christopher kept moving forward, holding her hand and bringing her along with him, trudging through the soot. She wanted to stop, to run away, maybe have children with her love one day, but she hid her desire to do so, and would instead allow her blind loyalty to him to get her killed. When they were but a step away, Christopher let go of Amy's hand and they stopped. He took the pipe in both hands, ready to try his luck, and said, "What are you going to do? Kill us with your mind or something?" "No," Lylin said. "Take one more step towards me, and you will have stepped into the path of a meteorite, one I predicted would kill the both of you thousands of years ago. So strong is my power, so perfect my sight. Everything that is transpiring has been foretold for eons." Amy's eyes widened, and she stepped forward and grabbed Christopher's arm, intent on pulling him away. In the same moment, he scoffed at Lylin and said, "A meteorite, yeah, right. Nice try." Then he took that step, and a practically inaudible zipping sound was heard as the meteorite went right through his skull, into Amy's chest, and then exited just above her pelvis, practically bisecting her. Christopher dropped to the floor dead. A big cloud of the soft dirt billowed out and then quickly buried him, and Amy dropped her recorder and wailed in pain, trying desperately to cover the gaping hole in her chest. She could hardly breathe, so the screaming didn't last long. Then she too fell over into the dirt, finding Christopher, and held his unresponsive hand as she suffocated and bled out. Lylin promptly walked toward them, Daniel being dragged along as she finally rested her arm, switching hands like he were a tote bag and not the single greatest threat to her that had ever existed. Then, when she was beside the still dying Amy, she bent down and, without having to feel around at all, the blind woman picked up her still broadcasting device, brushed it off, and brought the camera to bear on Amy, then up towards her own face. She addressed the world one more time before leaving them to survive on their own. She held the camera steady and moved her eyes to make it seem as though she were looking into the camera as best she could manage, and said, "In the end, your precious Daniel will have to make a choice between his existence and yours. I am going to keep him for a while. Good luck surviving until then, and when you see him again, urge him to make the right choice, because if he does not willingly sacrifice himself for you, you will all die in his place. Remember that when you say goodbye to him. He is finally going to do something good for you, and die to save you." Then she dropped the device and it disappeared into the dirt. Daniel took one more furious blind swing at her as she stooped down and peeled the dress off of the helpless, nearly dead woman, but his hand again went right through her head like his feet and legs went right through the ground. Then she put on the dress, dark red and wet with blood near the holes made by the killer meteorite, and walked on to where fate bid her next be, dragging the helpless ruler of the world along. Obviously a little infuriated from the open defiance of the demon spawn, she berated him as she swung him effortlessly with her walk, telling him more about himself than he ever knew in the process. By the end, he would understand himself in a fundamentally deeper way than he ever had before. He couldn't see where they were going. There were no nearby eyes for him to use now that Amy and Christopher were dead, and one as blind as the other, they together made their way to their fate.